Well, hello everyone. Thank you again for taking the time to join this little study today. Pray that you find blessing from it. Again, today's study will be a little different in that we're only going to look at one verse, but I want to teach you a little bit more of how to search the Hebrew language, how to study that part for yourself. And so you're going to see a little bit more in depth and show you some tools on how you can study this on your own. And I pray that you will be able to pursue that and get as much enjoyment out of it as I do. So right now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So right now you should be able to see from Bible Hub, we are in 1 Samuel chapter 14 and picking up at the 15th verse. And this verse here has so many beautiful, beautiful words in it that I just want to spend some time um, investigating because they just caught my attention so dramatically. And maybe this will do the same for you. Maybe it won't. So that's why we're only going to do one verse. So in case it's a little too boring or whatever, you won't have to endure too long. So as we look at verse 15, again, this is such a dramatic episode coming up here, remembering that last week Jonathan and his armor bearer went and attacked the garrison of the Philistines, and there were 20 people in this garrison, very small confined area, and Jonathan and his armor bearer climbed up, hands and feet, climbing this sheer rock, craggy area, and was able to defeat these 20 men who were in a much more secure position, more defensible. Again, there's no normal reason why they should have won, other than we see this is a supernatural event orchestrated by God coming up here. And that's where these words come into play today. So I want to show you a little bit about it. As you know, we're reading from Bible Hub. This is the Hebrew words here, reads from right to left. Above it is the phonetics on how to pronounce it. It's not completely accurate. This is classic or biblical Hebrew pronunciation. This is not modern or synagogue Hebrew pronunciation. If you do any learning with Jewish people, they will not pronounce it the way that you read it here. But if you take a college course for biblical Hebrew, then you will pronounce it more similar to what you find here in the Bible Hub. So it's Vayehi Hadara Harada, trembling. And this is where we want to look at this first word of Harada, of trembling, because it's mentioned a couple times, and trying to get the understanding that two men defeated 20 men, and suddenly throughout the whole hillside, throughout the whole area, there is something happening. There is something that causes fear, that causes trembling, that gives the impression that the earth shook. And so this is where it just captures my curiosity as to how how is this happening? We can just say, yes, God is doing it, and that's ultimately the result we're going to see here. But do the words in Hebrew give us any indication of just what a little more detail? And so we know the English is challenged to match the Hebrew when it comes to giving us depth and clarity. And so we're going to take a look at this word for trembling. We see that there's a number above it, 2731, and when you hover over it, up pops just a little pop out that says it's fear, anxiety, quaking, trembling, extreme anxiety, anxious care. Numerous choices the translators had to work with here to put down trembling. And so that's where our journey kind of starts. So in order to help you see how to do this, we're going to hover over this 2731 and we're going to click on it, and up pops the lexicon and gives us a little bit better detail. And remembering, this is a Christian viewpoint. These are Christian understandings. And so we're going to compare a little bit as to how the Hebrews, Jewish people, would look at this understanding versus those who are coming at it from a Christian point of view. What's also interesting here is that it uses a root word, and it gives you, of course, the NASB translations of care, dread, fear, terror, trembling, violently. It's got a little asterisk by it saying, okay, I'm not quite sure there. But what I find most helpful is to look at where else it was used in the scriptures. And so we see that on the right side here of something called the Englishman's Concordance, where it says that this Hebrew word was first used in Genesis 27, verse 33. And so that's where, again, it doesn't show much here, but what I did was I went back to my Bible and looked up Genesis 27:33, and was immediately aware that this was a story between of where Isaac was giving the birthright, and Jacob came and deceived him, pretended that he was Esau, dressed up and received the birthright and the blessing, and then disappeared. And then in comes Esau and comes before his dad and said, "Hey, Dad, here I am. Got your food. I'm ready to get the blessing." And this is where this verse comes in. This is the feeling that Isaac felt when Esau came, and all the emotions that went through Isaac's mind of, what happened? Who was here before you? How was I deceived? What was I, again, all these questions that we can only surmise because, of course, we know the text and we know the story. But whatever Isaac was feeling here after Jacob left and Esau came in, this same word is used to express his emotions. And they're very strong emotions. It says he trembled violently in the NAS. In the Interpreter's Bible, I think that's what the NINT stands for. He feared and trembled, feared very against. What kind of strange wording here. But what we're going to do is try to find out what actually was going on here. So we're going to need to go a little bit deeper into another type of biblical lexicon, kind of another word for a dictionary, and this is the Brown Driver Briggs. This is getting more at the Hebrew learning, the Hebrew understanding. They are Jewish scholars that put this lexicon together around the turn of the century of the 18th to 19th century here. And so we see that they chose this word, and what I find interesting is that this word has a feminine ending. And you'll see that in the same verse that the next time this word is used, it has a masculine ending. And this intrigued me to no end as to why this had a feminine ending on it when the rest of the body of the verse is all masculine or sort of a common ending. Why is this word for trembling and fear, anxiety coming from ascribed to a feminine ending? I couldn't find any good answer for it. I just wanted to make you aware of it, that these are things that can pique our interest, can help us in our studies, and to try to allow God's presence, God's Spirit to speak to us. Normally the feminine ending is associated with the side of God that deals with the compassionate, the merciful, the long-suffering. The masculine endings relate to the attributes of God that have to do with his judgment and his dealing in his punishments and judgments and protection from a standpoint of defeating enemies around about him. And so, again, what comes to mind is maybe God's expressing both. This is going to be a very monumental occasion that's coming up here, and God is working in both ways. He's working in a way that he's showing his mercy, and he's working in a way that he's showing his judgment. And so that's how I choose to deal with that and understand it. But the interesting thing is here is that the definitions in English are somewhat limited of trembling, of fear, of anxiety. And so what we want to do is go back and see, okay, what are some other sources that we can look at? And up at the top of my screen here, I have two other lexicons that I'm going to make you acquainted with. One is the Hebrew and Chaldean lexicon by Gesenius. You can see it was written in the 1800s. He was a Hebrew scholar back then, and compiled what basically created the basis for many people's study in the Hebrew language. And so along the side here, you'll see the contents. And what's helpful is to know the root of the word. Every Hebrew word has is called triconsonantal, which means there's three consonants that make up the root of this word. And just for the sake of helping you through this, it did show up in the last screen that we had, but the root here is a chet, a resh, and a daleth. And so as you learn the Hebrew, we'll look over here and we'll see that this character is the chet. So we click on it, and up comes everything that's underneath that letter. And so then we want to progress to the second letter of it, which is the resh, and the resh is near the end of the Hebrew alphabet. And so we look for, you don't always get exactly the word there, but you get kind of close. You can get to the page. And so we have the het, the resh, and then would be the vav, the vet, and we know that vet comes before the letter that we're looking for, which is the daleth. So we're going to advance just a page until we get to the chet, the resh, and the daleth. And here it comes up. You can see it on the left side of your screen, and it talks about what the meanings would be in a futuristic time frame or a futuristic tense. Hebrew itself doesn't have tenses like we do in English. They have what's called a perfect and an imperfect, the perfect being a completed form and the imperfect being a non-completed form. And so we kind of think of the perfect as being in the past, and we think of the imperfect as coming in the future. But it's wrong to limit ourselves to that thought, because in the Hebrew it can mean so much more. And so, but just to give you a feel for that, what's interesting here is with this word of tremble, I would have expected to see it in an intense form, which is known by the PL designation, but it's not in any intensity. It's just listed as something that is there, like a dictionary rendering of it. And so it has what we kind of expect: to come trembling, to fear, just to be fearful, to be afraid. It has, again, the words that we think of. But what's interesting here is it also, in Hebrew, words can be grouped by association, and which is something very different than in English. And so when you look up a word in the Hebrew lexicon or Bible, you can look at the word preceding it and the word following it, and sometimes gain just a little bit of extra insight. And so we're going to look at the word directly following it, which is Cheth Resh Hey, and we see that it means to burn or to be kindled. Okay, well, that's a very strong emotion, just like fear, just like terror. Sometimes very difficult to separate those emotions. And the one just prior to it, which is Het Resh Gimel and Lamed, is the word for a locust. Well, which would seem, way out of context, but remember what a locust does. A locust consumes, and the word for locust was based upon the idea that locusts were fearful creatures that came and ate everything, consumed everything, and could contribute to your loss of livelihood and maybe even your loss of life. So it's very fitting. So that helps create an imagery of what the basis for this word was. We also have another source we can go to that allows us to look at how this word was used in similar non-biblical books that existed about that time. And of course, the language that was common at that time was Aramaic. And so there is a Jewish book called The Dictionary of the Targumim, Talmud, and Midrashic Literature by Marcus Jastrow, written again 1926. And what he did was he went through everything that was non-biblical, all the literature that existed, and looked up these words and put their meanings derived from everyday common language of what texts were written about the biblical times. And that helps us to just get another viewpoint that maybe isn't based upon the scriptures, but it's based upon what was known as a language in that time. And we do the same thing. Most of us come to read our English Bibles with a background of English, of what we know words to mean before we ever opened up a Bible. And so this is very, very, very valuable. And so we look up, and I already had the page ready for it, but we look up the word chet, resh, and Dalet, and it says to be excited, to tremble. Okay, that was the word that was used, not much different than what we gained before. But there is one more source, and unfortunately isn't available on a digital format, but it's a man named Samson Hirsch, who was a linguist, and he has a book, which I looked it up before the class started, and he puts in here that his understanding from looking at the words, looking how it's used, he says it means to energize, it means to move very quickly. And that might fit this meaning a little bit better, because you see what the result was is the Philistines skedaddled out of there. They took out and took their leave and got out of there. So there was a trembling, there was something that happened. I also believe this was a terror, a trembling ascribed to a supernatural event. And so, but it caused them to flee. And so there's a lot happening in this one little word here. And this trembling occurred in numerous places. Look at this: in the camp, in the field, among the people. Now, there's three different ways that it's being affected. First is the camp, which is the tents. It's the army barracks. It's where the warriors and the soldiers are. Then it's in the field, which has nothing to do with the war, has nothing to do with people. It gives the impression that there was maybe an earthquake here that shook the ground. Again, a lot of interpretation. And then also it moved among the people. Okay, how do we explain that? Was it that the ground was shaking and it caused them to move, or was something happening in their spirit, something happening inside of them that caused them to have this anxiety, this fear build up? And so we see wherever it came from, however it was attributed, the garrison of the raiders, these were the soldiers. Again, this is, of course, the ones that Jonathan and his armor bearer killed are gone, but there were thousands remaining, and they felt something. They felt a trembling. They felt something stirring in the ground, something stirring in their spirit. Here we see the same word, harada, but it's in a common format. It means it's more of a masculine, because it's associated here. The words before it and after it are masculine. And so it's just a little different form of the word, but it gives us this understanding that God's presence was moving in a compassionate way, but then meaning the feminine ending, but also in a masculine way to perform judgment. And it was felt by both people differently. I'm sure if you could do an interview after this occasion and you could interview dozens of people who went through this, they might have all different viewpoints as to how they felt, what they experienced. And again, that's what makes this so interesting. And you can get this from the Hebrew language that you cannot pick up in the English. And so in addition to this trembling, now we got another new word. It's vatiraz, which is to quake. Okay, well, if the earth is trembling, uh, and they use that same word twice, why did they need to use a different word to talk about quaking? And so this is, again, just a very interesting group of words that are so fascinating. And I've showed you how to look them up in the Gesenius lexicon and in the Yastro's lexicon. But then, of course, Samson Hirsch looked at this word, and he thought that instead of trembling, this was a outside force causing pressure, causing a movement, that people moved based upon an outside force. And so you can kind of picture what's happening, that whatever God is doing, it's causing a stirring in people. It's causing an action in people. It's causing them to, these Philistines, to want to get out of there. They're just stricken with so much emotion that it's so fearful to them that they're just scattering. And we'll see that in the verses next week. Some of the words that are used, I believe, support that. And so the earth quaked. And then as we end this verse here, we see the word quaking and earth tied together, which again supports that there was a movement of the earth, that the earth shook. But what's interesting here is, of course, in our English versions, it would say the earth and the terror was from God. I'm going to read in the Hebrew Bible just to see how they have it. And it says, there was a trembling in the camp in the field among all the people in the garrison and the spoilers, and they trembled, and the earth quaked, so it grew into a great terror from God. What's interesting here is this thought of that this terror was from God is really not listed in an actual literal evaluation of the Hebrew scriptures. In front of each of the root words, there's often a preposition. And here we would have the he, which tells us that it's speaking of the earth, which is correctly interpreted. But then here for vatahi, we see that this is a vav preposition. So that is the word and. So it's the earth and was. And then when we get to the word for terror, which again, you can see the root word is the hate, resh, dalet, but it's also put in a feminine form, which is what it has the ta ending. But in the beginning, it has the lamet, and lamet is a preposition which normally means to, by, are the most common. It can mean from, so it's not a wrong translation, because ultimately it came from God. But was the earth shaking because God caused it to shake? Or if we were to translate this literally, it says the earth, the was, or to be, and the terror was to the terror God, is really what it's saying, to the terror God. So was it that the earth was shaking because of its understanding of what was happening, and it was a result of that, or was the shaking caused from God for an effect that ultimately caused the Philistines to leave, but yet it didn't frighten the Israelites. And that's what's so interesting. It had like a local effect on one group of people to bring fear and terror and cause them to scatter. But on the other hand, it strengthened and emboldened the Israelites to be able to conquer the Philistines. So was it from God, or was it to God for him using it as a tool to assist the Israelites? And so again, the outcome of what finally happens probably isn't changed. We're not creating any new doctrine or revelatory things, but it does give us an understanding of how much God is involved with the situation, and how much he has imparted into his word as to give us an idea of how much he created this and is involved with it, and the details that can be found through the study of the Hebrew scriptures. So I hope that wasn't too much for you today. I'm thankful that you stayed this long and enjoyed it, and I just pray that it will give you a better understanding of how much God loves us and cares for us, to leave us his word to be able to study and grow closer to him. So God bless you. Have a wonderful day, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.